She made a promise to leave one part of her father's legacy behind. Then a valley full of trapped operators, collapsing lines, and incoming mortars forced her to decide what a promise is really meant to protect. This story is not just about gunfire and survival. It is about judgment, duty, and the terrifying moment when the right choice breaks your word but saves hundreds of lives.
The radio static died. Her voice came through, an islet of calm in that God-forsaken valley. Fire poured from both ridgelines, the night shredded by steel tearing through flesh. Her tone sliced through the mayhem, a lifeline for 480 men, offering something no drill instructor ever could. Alpha, fall back west. 150 meters, she commanded. Use the gully to your left, go. Pinned behind a boulder, Commander Nate Harwick listened. 30 years of combat hadn't prepared him for a tactical disaster of this magnitude. He had 480 of his finest operators trapped in this gorge. They were deep in country, a war zone for 2 decades, on a mission that intelligence had sold as a walk in the park. That intel was pure garbage. The fire from the east was no mere ambush. It was a disciplined slaughter, perfectly timed by an enemy expecting them. The western ridge erupted in kind. The valley floor, clear on satellite feeds for weeks, had just become a kill box. Fiery tracers stitched the dark above him. A man screamed to his left, a sound of ruin the brain couldn't compute. To his right, 2 more went silent, a quiet, more final than any cry. He keyed the mic. "Doc, what's your 20? Medics are moving." The silence stretched. "I'm engaged, Commander," she replied. "Worry about the north corridor. They're setting up a mortar tube 200 meters east of you. Move your casualties before they find the range." He started to protest. Her voice overrode his rank, calm and certain, with an overview he didn't have. "Move the wounded, sir. I'm holding this position. Get them out." Harwick stared at his radio, stunned. In 3 decades, no one had ever spoken to him that way on the net. It wasn't the absence of fear in her tone, but something forged beyond it, a resolve from a certainty he'd seldom seen. He made the call. He complied. Years later, hardened veterans would talk about that night and admit words failed them. They'd never heard a voice like that on the radio. They said it cut through the noise and anchored your spirit when reality was splintering. She was on the northern slope, prone behind a rock, a fresh bullet wound in her shoulder. She'd already packed herself, one-handed. Blood soaked her jacket, bringing the cold shock of blood loss. But her focus was absolute, her right hand unshakable. And she just kept talking. 477 men saw the sun rise because of her. But this story isn't about that firefight. It's about the 18 hours before it, when a helicopter and a squad of elite operators badly misjudged the woman who stepped off it. They were wrong about almost everything. The FOB was at 6,000 feet, a temporary speck on a tactical map. It had a generator, 3 connected huts, a medical tent, a comm station, and a perimeter they'd reinforced twice that week. The men who built it knew that extra work was survival, not pessimism. Jagged peaks walled them on 3 sides, the 4th opening to the valley. The thin air was a biting, persistent cold that gear couldn't stop, a constant they learned to ignore. You learn to function despite the things you can't fix. The cold was one of them. The last chopper of the day came in at 1700 hours, skimming low along the ridgeline. The rotor wash blasted the ground as it touched down. The crew chief pushed out 2 fuel cells and a pallet of medical gear. A lone figure followed. The helicopter was already lifting as she cleared the landing zone. The wash hit her, but she just held her hair and kept walking, no hesitation. She already knew where she was going. She'd committed the base layout to memory 3 days prior. She'd also locked away another detail from that intel file, one she kept to herself. She'd found an irregularity, the very reason she took this job. She guarded that intel like a concealed weapon. The duffel bag was standard issue, the Pelican case held her medical supplies. She wore gray cargo pants and a fleece, moving with a practiced economy that needed no approval. Petty Officer First Class Colt Briggs watched from the edge of the pad as she walked past him, tablet in hand. He stood 6'2", 220 pounds of Special Forces muscle built over 12 years. He assessed her with the same rapid, cold logic he used for everything. He turned to the man beside him and said what he thought. Her damn gear outweighs her. His teammate started to speak, saw the look on Briggs's face, and shut his mouth. He wasn't far off. She was 5'4" at most, maybe 118 pounds, soaking wet. Her hair was pulled back, no fuss. The sentry had checked her contractor ID twice. Her eyes were dark and they never stopped moving a methodical scan, not a simple look. But Briggs wasn't paying attention to details like that. His judgment was set, his mind already on his own pre-mission checklist. Her name was Tessa Cole. The manifest had her as a Navy corpsman and civilian contractor, brought in by Naval Special Warfare Command to fill a sudden billet. Her credentials were flawless. Johns Hopkins, full trauma certification. She had 2 prior deployments, both non-combat support. Her file noted 53 field interventions. All 53 patients made it. That specific number made Commander Harwick pause. A perfect record wasn't just skill, it was something else. He found her in the med tent 40 minutes after she landed. She had already broken down the crates, laying out supplies by trauma category. She was cross-checking the inventory with the op plan on a notepad, working with quiet competence. She looked up as he came in, her focus shifting instantly. "Commander Harwick, you've seen the op plan." "Yes, sir." "Questions?" Her head tilted slightly. The casualty projection uses pre-2021 data. With current conditions, I'd increase that estimate by 20%. He studied her. "It's a logistics problem," she added. "The terrain makes the aid station a likely first target. I need to cache med kits at 3 rally points. I can handle it tonight." Harwick was silent. He expected the usual contractor check-in about comms or CASEVAC plans. He hadn't anticipated an independent risk assessment of his casualty figures. "Make it happen," he said. He left the tent, pausing in the sharp air. He filed the interaction away. It was one of those details that could become critical later. Briggs made his verdict known 3 times before chow. First, at gear check, he griped that her medkit was stocked for a major battle. Second, during the brief, she sat quietly in the back, her gaze fixed on the topo map with an intensity you could almost feel. He delivered his final judgment at dinner. He told 3 other operators she was a liability, stating it like a fact. It wasn't personal. In Briggs's world, liability was the most important word there was. A liability was a variable that gets your team killed. It was a threat to be identified and neutralized before an op. He was protecting his men. He would have told you that, and he would have believed it, and he wouldn't have been entirely wrong. He never knew she heard him from the other side of the canvas. She just finished her food in silence. It was a lesson from her father. Ignore the noise. Words are a resource to be spent only when necessary. Everything else is just static that drains your power. She had practiced that discipline for 16 years. At dusk, Chief Petty Officer Vance Dunar found her near the wire. He was 53, built like a man who'd spent his life doing hard things, and he had a quiet stillness the younger men hadn't earned yet. It was the calm of a man who had walked through hell and carried the weight of it without breaking stride. He'd said little since she arrived, just observing her with an expression that seemed to be confirming something he already suspected. He found her on the eastern perimeter as she watched the shadows consume the valley. He stood beside her for a long minute, sharing the view. "Your father was Frank Cole." She waited 2 heartbeats before answering. "Yes," she said. "SEAL Team 3, Desert Storm, Somalia. Retired 2012. She finally looked at him. Trained under him at Coronado in '95, Dunar stated, "I was a cocky 24-year-old, thought I was God's gift, right before he showed me what that really looked like." A beat passed. For close to an hour, Frank painstakingly dismantled that notion. His politeness only made it cut deeper. "He never brought you up," she said. "He kept names out of it." "That sounds like him," Dunar conceded. "But he mentioned you once. Saw him years before he passed. Said his girl had the knack. He called it the rarest thing he'd seen in 40 years, and he was teaching it to feel its own strength." She said nothing. He died in 2019, March 14th. Brain bleed. 57, survived all that, just to check out in a San Diego hospital. 3 days after a stroke hit him out of the blue. She recited it without bitterness or show, just facts worn smooth by time. Dunar gave a slow nod. "I'm sorry for your loss," he offered. "Thank you." The valley was a black pit. Stars outlined the ridgeline as the camp generator fired up, the lights flickering before holding. "The way you scanned that topo map," Dunar said softly, "you looked to the high ground, not the objective, during the Overwatch plan." He waited a beat. "That was your old man, right there." She kept silent. "Look, this ain't an interrogation," he clarified. "I'm telling you what I saw. I get what it means. And whatever you're running, this whole camp isn't going to be blind to who you are." He held her gaze. "Someone had to know. Now you know I do." He turned back to the compound. She remained at the wire for a long time. "Now, you need to get something straight about Frank Cole. He was a nobody. You won't find his name in any after-action report from his 30 years in. No books, no interviews, nothing. His reputation lived where it mattered, in hush talk between operators, the kind of history that's never written down. He shipped out at 18. He got through Bud, S on raw grit and a mental stillness the Coronado cadre saw but couldn't label. He wasn't the top stud or the fastest. He was the guy who, when things went sideways, would just retreat to a place inside where the suck couldn't find him and just keep going. Not every man has a place like that. He earned his pin, got good, and then became something else. A guy who didn't just know times how times to do the work, but times why, asterisks. He understood the chasm between the two. Desert Storm in 91, Somalia in 93. October that year, a fight that became a byword for a shit show. 3 tours in Afghanistan after 9/11. Long-range missions so deep in the black they were erased from every report, beyond the reach of any public records request. In the parlance of his kind, he became a ghost not by choice, but by trade. He punched out in 2012, landed in San Diego, ran at 0530 daily, kept his kit squared away, and instructed at a private range you'll never hear of. When his daughter hit 10, he placed a rifle in her hands. Not to forge a copy of himself, he was clear on that, and she got it. He did it because he felt that to grasp a weapon, from its physics to the weight of the choice to use it, was to grasp a core truth about power and what follows. He trained her for years, every weekend possible, and on summer mornings before the heat clamped down. Windage, breathing, trigger press, the cold math of a shot, the discipline to wait for it, knowing the difference between a shot U times can times take and one U times must asterisk. At 16, she rang steel at 900 meters in a brutal crosswind. He watched the hit, paused, and just said, "Fix your follow-through." She did. His lack of praise was the compliment, a language she learned to speak. Her getting into Johns Hopkins had his quiet, solid backing. He knew her hands were meant to mend, a belief he held firm, even while he taught them how to break. It was a heavy, complicated gift. In March of 2018, he wrote a final letter, a set of orders he never spoke of. He sealed it, stashing it for the right moment. He knew the numbers on his heart were bad, and he faced that reality head-on. But he was a planner, which meant putting final words to paper. He died on March 14th, 2019, in a hospital bed. He was 57. She was 21, a sophomore. The call hit at 6 a.m. And for an hour, she just sat in her dorm, feeling the foundation of her world crumble. The ground was gone from under her. Her entire mental framework had to be rebuilt on the fly. Then she got up, went to class, and handled the next task. Just like he taught her, 2 weeks later, back home, she found the letter with his things. She read it in her old bedroom in Denton, Texas, as winter light cut through the window. She went through it once, straight through, then folded it into a pocket where it had been ever since. That thought surfaced now as she moved back to the aid station to prep her blowout kits. She cached her primary gear at 3 solid points with multiple exfil routes. It was a solo op, after lights out, totally off the grid. No one saw a thing. It didn't matter. The next morning, 4 hours before step-off, she found Reed Kowalski. He was 23, vibrating with the energy of a boot before his first real dance. A coiled spring of a man at his physical peak, clueless about the bill that was coming due. He ran his PCC south of the wire, looking sharp, just as his med chart said. Fit for duty. For 90 seconds, she observed. She saw the slight lag in his blink, a tiny strain no one would ever spot. But spotting the tells was her job. It was all she'd ever known. She watched his hands on his weapon. His grip was by the book, but his rhythm was off by a beat. She saw the fractional delay when another Marine called his name. A slow reflex. She closed the distance. Kowalski. He glanced up, his face clear. No worries. Doc, hold up a sec. He stopped. She checked his pulse, fingers light on his wrist. She checked his pupils. Then she rapid-fired 3 questions, clocking his responses. You've got early-stage heat exhaustion, she said, her voice flat. Started yesterday, judging by the signs. Your core temp's elevated, pulse is off. I'm putting you on an IV. You're off heavy kit for 3 hours. He began to argue, exactly as she expected. Doc, I'm good to go. Your reaction time is down 12%. She cut him off. You don't feel it, because inside your own head, everything feels fine. Tonight, that 12% is how someone ends up in a bag. If you go down on the objective, you're a liability. She let the words land. Commander Harwick needs to know. Kowalski watched her, his expression shifting. Roger that. Take a knee. Her IV kit was prepped in 20 seconds. Harwick walked over, observing her work silently. When she was done, her report was brief. He'll be mission ready in 3 hours with fluids. Light duty until 1400. Harwick gave a curt nod and moved on. Briggs had been watching from 10 feet away. He repositioned himself, and for the next half hour, the way he watched her was completely different. The mission brief kicked off at 1300 in the command tent. It was wall to wall. Harwick ran it with zero wasted motion. For him, planning and doing were one continuous act. Tessa stood near the back with a notebook, her focus so total she almost disappeared. People who see everything are seldom seen themselves. A topo map was projected on the wall. Eastern Valley, 8 clicks out. A confirmed weapons cache in a structure. Ingress via the valley with a backup route on the North Ridge. 1 sniper assigned, Staff Sergeant Ulrich, a solid shooter. 1 doc assigned her. She scanned the map. As Harwick pointed out 2 sniper hides, she analyzed the layout. Without looking up, she spoke. The rock formation at grid 477 puts friendlies in the backblast cone if he misses. The ledge at 479, 30 meters north, is a better hide and gives him a cleaner line of sight. The tent fell silent. Harwick looked from the map to her. How do you know that? He demanded. I'm reading the terrain, she answered. He stared at the map for 5 more seconds. He then changed the plan, moving the overwatch to her suggested location. Briggs was standing 6 feet from her. She didn't look, but she felt his attention sharpen. The subtle shift of a man whose bedrock beliefs just took a hit. She made a note and went quiet. The final hours before a push have a certain weight. The camp settled, movements became more precise. Marines went internal, steeling their minds for the coming violence. Rifles were field stripped with a focus paid for in blood. Gear was rechecked, then checked again. She ran her own med pre-checks. Then she sat, her hand over the stiff paper of the letter in her breast pocket. For 5 years it had lived there, a constant pressure against her ribs. Her father knew that decisive moments don't show up on a schedule. They hit you sideways, and they hit you fast. They come with no warning, so you say what matters when there's time. He had already said his part. She had read his last orders so many times they were now the framework of her own mind. The training was no longer memory, it was instinct, hard as bone. She felt it in her chest as the air turned sharp. Insertion was at 2100 hours, 3 slicks running dark and low through the peaks. Strapped into the second bird, Tessa watched the Black Mountains ghost by. Her mind was a calm lake, a state he'd drilled into her for years. The target was 3 clicks out across a shooting gallery that narrowed uphill. Intel called it a milk run. Drones saw Jack squat. The objective was supposedly a cakewalk, but she knew the gap between supposedly and actually was a mile wide. The data wasn't wrong, just incomplete. Ambushes live in the blind spots. Kept that thought to herself. Her job was the unknown. 2 clicks out, the choppers vanished. The valley was watching them. She stuck with the aidman, conserving energy. In the gloom, Vance's eyes found hers. Like he had radar, he looked away. She swept her sector, pure muscle memory. At 3.5 kilometers, her gut screamed that something was off. A heat shimmer rippled off the rocks. It happened again. That was a rhythm, not a fluke. She clocked it mentally. Then the night tore open. RPG. The concussion slammed into them. Both ridgelines lit up like the 4th of July. A textbook kill zone. It was just about survival now. The squad scattered, pure training kicking in. She was already behind cover, her trauma kit ripped open. The first casualty crawled right to her. Kowalski was fading out. Femoral artery hit. She cranked the TQ high and tight, then started packing the wound. She spoke to him, giving hard truths, not empty comfort. He needed to stay sharp to live. Look at my face. The third casualty was dragged in. Sucking chest wound, tension pneumothorax. A 14-gauge needle went in. The hiss of air confirmed it. The Ridge machine guns had them pinned cold. Those nests had solid cover from below. Harwick needed a way to see them. Ulrich's rifle was useless from this angle. She mentally mapped the gun positions while stabilizing the last man. She glanced at the Ridge, then at Dunar. He understood immediately. She set her aid bag down. That heavy machine gun was a buzzsaw, nothing more than deadly math. She pulled the letter from her pocket, feeling its familiar weight. She'd carried it for 5 years. Tonight, it all finally made sense. She tucked the letter away, then looked at Dunar. The M24? He knew which one she meant. She was already on her feet. The rifle felt like a part of her arm. 10,000 practice shots made it pure reflex. She gave it a quick function check. It wasn't her preferred glass, but she would make it work. Dunar settled into a spotter's position. They didn't need words. She started up the slope, a steep 35-degree incline. The deep darkness was her only camouflage. She climbed like smoke, a trained and deliberate silence. The incoming tracers were just background noise. Dirt kicked up close by. She adjusted her path. Dunar's calm voice in her ear fed her intel. From this new angle, their cover was worthless. She'd already seen the geometry of it in her head hours ago. She found her firing position and went prone. The rifle stock settled into her shoulder like it was custom made for her. She found them in the scope. 2 tangos in a sandbag nest. 780 meters out, she breathed. Her father's voice echoed from a Texas dawn when she was 10. It's not about force. It's about science and control. Becoming a perfect machine for one impossible second. 5 years to be adequate, he'd said. 20 to be good. The difference between luck and true intent. Wind was east-northeast, 12 miles per hour, confirmed at 780. A 12-mile-per-hour crosswind was about 14 inches of drift. She clicked the windage turret, adjusting for altitude, cold, and the Earth's spin. Breathe in for 4. Hold. Breathe out for 8. The rhythm dropped her heart rate to the low 60s. The precision zone, it was automatic, drilled into her since she was 12. Natural aim, shift 2 inches. Muscle invites error. Bone provides stability. She let the reticle settle. She felt her pulse, hunting for the dead space between beats, the quarter second of perfect calm. That was her window. She pressed the trigger. The familiar recoil kicked back. She reacquired the target. A miss, 8 inches to the right. The gunner was already scrambling for cover. On the net, she heard Briggs's tone. Thick with, I told you so. It didn't matter. Only the miss. She reran the numbers. Gusts. She'd missed the damn gusts. Through the scope, she read the heat mirage rising from the rock, saw the repeating pattern. A gust hit every 8 seconds. 4 clicks left. She found her rhythm again. The breath, the pulse, the pause. She waited for the 2-second lull in the gust cycle. She sent the round. The heavy gun went silent. Dunar's voice, deadpan. Target down, guns cold. She was already gone. The second gun was 140 meters south. New angle, new math. She moved 30 meters down the slope to get the shot, low and smooth. Rushing in the dark gets you killed. In position. Target acquired at 920 meters. She read the thermals and a wind shear she spotted off the valley grass. One shot, she was moving. 37 minutes, 6 positions. The enemy guns fell systematically, heavies first, then support, then the light machine guns covering the exfil route. She flowed through the darkness, executing the plan already formed in her head. She only fired when the solution was perfect. After that first miss, every round hit home. Below, the battle turned. Pin squads pushed forward as the enemy fire just evaporated. She heard Harwick exploiting the lanes she opened. She wasn't consciously thinking anymore. The time for that was over. The decision was made in the valley when she grabbed the rifle. This was just the execution. This was what her father had taught her. The focus to endure the hard part where everyone else breaks. She never broke. After the last gun went silent, she scanned for 90 full seconds. Satisfied, she keyed her mic. Harwick, both ridges are clear. Exfil routes open. Advise main road. Silence. Then Harwick's voice came back, struggling to process what just happened. Copy that, Doc. What's your 20? North slope, 80 meters up. On my way down. A longer pause. Come down easy, he ordered. She descended. Dunar met her. Harwick and his men just stood there, staring. She paid their stares no mind. Moving to Alrek's kit, she stowed the rifle, popped her medpack, and knelt by the first man down. Who's hit? A profound quiet fell, the sort that happens when hardened pros see something that breaks their frame of reference. It wasn't simple confusion. The men in the valley understood the sequence of events. The facts were simple. Shots out, tangos down. Then she descended the slope, put away the weapon, and resumed her role as a medic as if the previous 37 minutes never occurred. Their silence was the sound of reality being violently reshaped. Briggs stood on the periphery for 4 minutes before approaching her. She was patching up a staff sergeant named Dow for a ricochet in the calf. He watched her work for 2 more minutes without a word. His expression was one of a man making a deep, honest revision of his own judgment. "Where in God's name did you learn to shoot like that?" he finally asked. She didn't look up. "My father. Who was he?" A brief glance, then her attention was back on the wound. Navy. Briggs looked to Dunar, who stood nearby, cool as a man holding a perfect hand. Harwick joined Briggs, his command presence absolute, processing the new data without showing a crack in his authority. He was managing it, but his eyes were fixed on her, building a completely new assessment. "Cole," he stated. "Sir, when you're finished." 3 minutes, sir." He waited. After securing Dow's dressing, she rose to face the commander. He saw her differently now. "Your father?" he started. "Frank Cole, Master Chief, retired, SEAL Team 3. He was in Desert Storm, Somalia, and did 3 rotations in Afghanistan." Harwick's head snapped toward Dunar. "Frank Cole," Dunar affirmed. The name spoken like a law of nature. Briggs was already moving, heading for a SATCOM. He was about to request Frank Cole's jacket, and what he was going to find would take all night to digest. A new quiet settled on the valley, not peace, but the dense silence of an aftermath, where the air itself seemed to remember the fight. She looked at Harwick. "I have 4 more casualties to check before we're wheels up." "Get to it," he ordered, watching her go. An hour before sunrise, with the wounded stabilized and the perimeter locked down, Harwick found her. She was on the eastern flank, her back to a boulder, restocking her trauma kit with an economy of motion that was pure muscle memory. He picked a spot for a conversation, not a cross-examination. She was already expecting him. Somalia. Her hands paused for a second. October 3rd and 4th, 1993. Her father mentioned it twice. Once when she was 14 and wouldn't let it go. Again at 20, during a lesson on trauma medicine, when he shared a hard truth about sustained combat. She resumed her inventory. "Most guys who were there don't talk about it." "No," Harwick said. "They sure don't." He looked at the horizon. "He trained you himself. From age 10, 6 years of structured training. Weekends, mornings, summers, wind calls, range estimation, trigger control, the cold science and discipline of it. A plastic case snapped shut. He was always my instructor. He ran out of things to teach me by the time I was 19. After that, We just kept the skills sharp. Then he was gone. And I made a promise to my mom. She said it like a simple fact. She'd watched him go to war for 30 years. She asked me to let that side of his life end with him. Not all of it, just the part that dealt in taking lives, not saving them. I gave her my word. And tonight was a tactical necessity. She finally met his gaze. My father taught me a promise is not the same as the thing it guards. The promise is just the framework. What it protects is why you made it. When the framework and the reason no longer align, you choose your real loyalty. Harwick studied her. Sounds like a man I would have liked to know. He was the best man I ever knew, she said, not with emotion, but with the flat certainty of a proven theorem. He was quiet for a beat. Chief Dunar called Frank Cole a ghost, said it was the highest compliment he had. Vance Dunar doesn't say things he doesn't mean. He said the same of you. She didn't respond. Harwick stood up, pausing before his final directive. I want a full debrief after exfil. He clarified. Not a tactical AAR of tonight. About you. Your background, your full skill set, and what should have been in my brief. This is for command awareness, not discipline. I need to know all my assets. Understood, sir. He began to walk away. Commander. He stopped. Kowalski needs a surgeon within 6 hours. My patch job will hold. But that's his window. The call's already in. He gave her a final look. Get some rack time, Cole. She turned back to her equipment, starting another check. She didn't bother to say that real rest was no longer available to her. She just focused on the work, because the work was everything, and it would have to be enough. There was a letter. She'd first read it when she was 21 in a dorm room in Baltimore. Winter light filled the room, and the normal sounds of campus life felt like they were from another planet. She found it with his personal effects 2 weeks after the funeral, a single envelope marked with her name. Sitting in her old bedroom, gutted by grief, she had opened it. He began with practical matters, as he always did. Financial documents, his attorney's number, pension details, VA info. He was thorough, a fact for which she had been grateful. Clear directions are a lifeline when your world has turned to smoke and ash. Then came the rest. Tessa, I have to tell you something I wish I could say in person, if I had that kind of warning. But time is rarely so considerate, and I've learned that you must say the important things ahead of time. In the moment of crisis, there's usually no room for them. He wrote, You made a promise to your mother, and I respect that. I was the reason she needed to ask it of you. I understand her heart in this. Your mother has a kind of wisdom we both lack, the type learned by loving a man in a hard business for 30 years and finding a way to carry that weight. He had written, but I also have to say this. I am the one who taught you these things. I did it because it was critical for you to know, not because I wanted you to be like me. I was clear on that point from day one. I taught you because genuine, deep knowledge is the only way to bear a heavy responsibility. A person who is ignorant of a power is ruled by it. A person who understands it has a choice. He had written, I trust your judgment. I have since you were 12 years old. You have a quality I can't name in how you absorb facts and arrive at a decision. It's incredibly rare. In 40 years of working with men under fire, I can count on one hand the number of times I have seen it. He had written, a day will come when you have to decide between that promise and what you know is right. I can't see that moment or tell you what to do. I can only state that I trust you will see the difference. And whatever you choose, my pride in you was cemented long before that day ever arrived. He signed it simply, your father. Not with love, just with the statement of fact, which was perfect. She had read the letter 40 times since. Every word was burned into her memory, but she kept the paper itself. It held a truth that memory couldn't. The feel of the page, the impression of the ink, the quiet fact of his hand having moved across this sheet in a room she could still picture. She had held it in her hand at the base of the ridge right before she picked up the rifle. Now she sat with her kit in the cold, allowing the dawn to come as it always did, bringing a sharp, clinical clarity to the night's actions. In the first light, she allowed herself to think about the promise. She broke it. There was no other way to see it. She had stood in her mom's kitchen in Denton, Texas, and made a promise she fully intended to honor. Tonight, she had not. Both statements were true. Both had to exist in the same space inside her. Her father knew this would happen. He knew a time would come when the promise and the correct action would conflict, and she would know it. She'd Vulcan 60 operators would witness this sunrise. Kowalski was 23. He'd survive surgery and rehab and have a life. The 40 men in the kill box who would have been hit by the mortar attack if the enemy guns hadn't been silenced would live to see tomorrow and the day after that. She took that knowledge and filed it away. Then she sat motionless and watched the valley take shape in the growing light. Briggs found her an hour after sunrise. He approached without any preamble, took a seat on a rock nearby, and watched the peaks for a moment before he spoke. He didn't look at her. "Frank Cole," he said. "I pulled his service record on the SATCOM this morning." She said, "Nothing. Desert Storm. 11 confirmed long-range engagements during the Kuwait campaign, all by the numbers. Somalia. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 7 commendations, 4 of which were redacted at a security clearance I don't have." He paused. The public part of his jacket is a full career for most snipers. I have to figure the sealed part is just as heavy. She was silent. "I said something when you first got here," he said. "I see it now, and I'd take it back if I could, but that bell's been rung." He finally met her eyes, the facade cracking. It was the raw look of a man staring his own failure in the face. "One piece of intel. I gambled on it. That's not leadership. It's a damn screw-up, one I've made before and had no business repeating." "It was a command decision based on the facts available," she said. "That's the job. A job I botched," he shot back. "Faulty procedure, garbage result." The words hung between them. "So, own it," she said. "Then put it in the lessons learned file." My old man would have said the same. His gaze shifted to her. Was he always that blunt? He was a one-and-done kind of teacher. You heard it once, you were expected to get it. She hesitated. He'd spend all night breaking down this op, finding every screw-up, and then he'd have called the end result serviceable. That was as good as a medal from him. Briggs let that sink in. When he rose, something had changed in him, a core shift beyond just straightening up. "Just so we're clear," he said, "your work on that ridgeline was textbook, best I've ever seen." He spun on his heel and left. She saw him go. The birds arrived at 0900. She worked on 2 wounded during the ride out, her tone calm and procedural as she managed the damage. Kowalski was awake, his gaze locking with hers. No words were needed. The FOB emerged from the brownout as they landed. She moved directly from the helo to the BAS, relaying every procedure and tactical choice to the surgeons. A smooth patient transfer was everything. A firefight victor could still die in surgery. 2 hours passed. When she finally came out, Harwick was waiting. He stood with that solid quiet of a man past the shock and into the reckoning. They sat down on some spare ammo cans. "Run it down for me," he said. "How'd you end up here?" The assigned doc, Marsh, had his appendix go nova 4 days back. His slot hit the contractor pool. "I volunteered. Why?" She'd expected the question. "I reviewed the op order. It only had 1 sniper. I checked Staff Sergeant Ulrich's record. Good shooter, squared away, but this battle space is too damn big for 1 rifle." The posting was for a corpsman. She held his look. "I could do both, so I filled the billet." Harwick just looked at her. "You boarded that bird with capabilities you didn't declare. I knew it was a likely contingency, not a guarantee. You kept it to yourself. My medical certs are official. My trigger time isn't. My dad trained me for survival, not for a service record. NavSpecWar has no paper on it." She didn't blink. "If I'd declared it, red tape would have killed it. It takes too long to approve a second shooter. I had 4 days. The machine would have sent a warm body, not an operator who'd already wargamed the mission and saw the hole." He said nothing. "You knew coming in," he said slowly, "and you positioned yourself to fix the problem without a word." "Yes, but why hide it? If I'd arrived as a sniper who also patched holes, this whole tour would be a debate over paperwork I don't have. I'd have wasted my time justifying my presence instead of doing my job." She let that sink in. The objective came first. He got up, paced, then faced her. The AAR will be unfiltered, he said. Every last detail? This brief goes all the way up. No telling what the blowback will be. You get that, right? I do. It could get bad for you, sir. 3 dead, 22 wounded, mission failed. It's a goat rope. My actions get recorded straight, or they don't. A lie just covers my ass, and that's not the objective. He studied her for a long moment. Put it down as it happened, she said again. He gave one sharp nod and headed for the TOC. She stayed, watching the peaks in the hard, clean light of dawn. Her hand touched her sternum. I broke my word, and it was the right call. He understood. Maybe I always did, too. She rose and returned to her admin. The file on Owen Graff came down the pipe at 1300 the following day. Harwick scanned it, then summoned his leadership. It was thin. The critical ones always are. Graff, born 1973 in Knoxville, Tennessee, joined up at 18. He went down the path that sorts the wolves from the sheep. Made it through Delta Selection. The CIA's Special Activities Division grabbed him in his 30s. They were the ghosts, handling deniable ops. By all measures, he was born for it. The file described a tactical genius, but one who carried the weight, unlike the guys just running the program. He felt the cost of his work. The file flagged that as a strength right before it became a problem. 2012, Syria, Operation Cardinal. He ran a 4-man element. They got the job done, but their ride home was compromised. They dropped smoke and screamed for pickup. Help was on the way. Then, with 40 minutes to go, the evac was scrubbed. The official story was weather. 2 different satellite feeds showed blue skies. 3 of his guys were killed in the ensuing fight. They took Graff. He survived 18 months of hell. His escape was detailed with intentional ambiguity. The military declared him killed in action in December of 2012. They were wrong. For 12 years, he's been busy, and what he'd been building was now aimed at them from the high ground. His plan wasn't crazy. It was cold. This was the result of a man with a decade to focus on a single issue, forcing a reckoning for shadows and lies. Harwick put the folder down. He isn't some jihadist, Harwick said, not trying to set the world on fire. He's after one thing: accountability for a very specific betrayal. The statement hung in the air. Doesn't make it right, but it makes him more of a threat than any true believer. A rational man is predictable. The weight of it landed on them all. He's coming back tonight, Harwick announced. Nobody argued. You don't dedicate 12 years to something, then walk away after one bad night. Tessa stood near the wall, quiet. She'd already seen the intel, reading it over his shoulder. He hadn't stopped her. One pass through the file was all it took. The facts reshuffled her entire view of the conflict. She imagined a man in Syria, 2012, hearing salvation inbound, only for it to be replaced by the silence of abandonment. She considered what 18 months of that would do to a man's soul, how it would shatter his belief in the system, in the flag itself. She pictured the slow-acting venom of being sold out by your own and the hatred it would breed for years. She packed those thoughts away and went back to the BAS. The next 4 hours were pure prep. She restocked her medkits and shifted supply caches, thinking through the new angles of attack he'd use now. She reviewed every casualty file, knowing first aid only buys you time. Then, she methodically ate a hot meal. Her father's voice, food and sleep are ammunition, not luxuries. He was rarely wrong. She stole 90 minutes of solid, combat-ready sleep, the kind you grab in the lulls. Back in the aid station, she confirmed her preps. Dunar showed up at 1700, filling the doorway. He didn't speak. They exchanged a look that said it all. The type earned when hell breaks loose and words become useless. It's gonna be a real fight tonight, he said. I know. Your surprise factor is gone. Graff's seen what you can do. He'll be waiting. She nodded once. Hands okay? She gave them a quick look, cataloging a small blister from the night before. She mentally logged it as irrelevant. Good to go, she said. He got quiet in that way he did just before dropping a bomb. Got a message from your old man, he said. January of 2019. 2 months before he died, she froze. Said he needed to tell me about a project of yours. Said he was proud. He never wrote things down. so I knew this was a big deal. Dunar's eyes fixed on the canvas wall, seeing the memory there. He told me you were consulting for a nav specware unit. Your own time. Unofficial. He stopped for a beat. He wrote that you developed a new protocol for combat casualty care. Called it the single biggest leap in special operations training in 20 years. Verbatim. Her gaze locked on a nearby crate. Said you kept your name off it so the lessons would land without the brass getting in the way. He said you made the right play, that it was all you. Snapping the case closed, she whispered. He was aware. A hush settled in the tent. Sunlight cut through the canvas, painting shapes on the equipment. Beyond, the wind howled. Dunar finally spoke. I have a reason for keeping this. I recognized you on arrival, but I didn't know everything. I'd heard Frank's kid was making waves, but I underestimated the scope of it all. I didn't know you were the voice. He met her gaze directly. Bringing it up earlier could have thrown you off your game. Frank knew you'd get the job done without seeking accolades. I felt I owed you both that same courtesy. She sized him up. He was always 10 moves ahead, she murmured. That he was, you knew when I landed. I had a pretty good idea. The briefing solidified it. When you laid out the Overwatch plan, your whole approach has a specific fingerprint. It was unmistakable. He let that hang. He gave you the foundation, and you built something he couldn't have dreamed of. She stayed quiet. For 3 years, she developed that system off the books, beyond her official medic role, filling a void she saw. It wasn't some sanctioned program with paperwork and approval stamps. It was a mindset built from the ground up to fix a fatal flaw in battlefield casualty response and tactical command. Her instruction was delivered via a sterile voice comms channel. No visuals, no insignia, completely untraceable. The trainees dubbed the instructor the mentor. She neither accepted nor rejected the title. She just worked. It happens tonight, she stated. Tonight, he agreed. He exited the tent, giving her a moment in the dimming light. Then she sought out Harwick. At 10 p.m., Graf attacked. He emerged from the earth to the south, using drainage conduits that wound below the valley, a labyrinth the initial survey deemed impenetrable. That assessment was mostly accurate, but not entirely. 200 hostiles erupted from 4 southern points simultaneously. They acted as one, a force trained for this exact maneuver. This was no repeat of the last failed push. This was a fresh doctrine from the same sharp intellect. It proved he'd analyzed his prior failure. The line held for 4 minutes. Harwick anticipated the southern vector and had arranged his defenses. The disciplined volley that greeted them broke their initial assault wave. A second wave hit, followed by a third. Constant, coordinated pressure from 3 vectors collapsed their defensive pocket quicker than planned. It was a textbook counter to a known defensive posture. Tessa was in the aid station when rounds started snapping above. In less than a minute, she was on the eastern line, shuffling low beneath the tracers. Medkit in one hand, rifle on her back, the 2 jobs were now one. The internal conflict had vanished in the last 18 hours. A fire team of 12, led by Briggs, held the east flank. She reached them and immediately assessed the most critical injury. Corporal Holloway had a through-and-through thigh wound, untreated. She went to work, her gaze sweeping their position. The most intense fire originated from high ground 200 meters southeast, giving the enemy a clear view of the line. Briggs had 2 men on suppression, but their firing angle was poor. They were only making the enemy duck, not eliminating the threat of fatal distinction. She packed the wound and tightened the TQ. Briggs! That gun at 210, you've got no angle. He glanced at her but didn't argue. 400 meters out, 2 tangos. The left one's exposed on his cycle. While she was already scrambling to a better vantage point, I need 1 minute. She dropped behind a crate, acquiring the target. She adjusted her optic for the conditions. The wind was tricky up here. The hostile had a pattern. Expose for 3 seconds, cover for 4. She observed for 3 cycles to verify his rhythm, then fired on the 4th. The left target disappeared. She crawled 40 meters north for a better angle on the second gunner, who had repositioned. She found him and fired. The high ground fell silent. Within 30 seconds, she was back, checking Holloway's TQ. She adjusted the tourniquet as Briggs registered what happened. He just stared, speechless. She was already moving to the next casualty. At 10:40 p.m., Kowalski went down. He'd been on light duty on a rear line that was now the front line as they contracted. He was doing his part until his body just quit on him. She'd been casually monitoring his respiration all day, a standard practice. His O2 sats at 4 p.m. were borderline low. His breathing was shallow, which she had attributed to pain management, a miscalculation, an error she'd been silently questioning for hours. At 10:40 p.m., the sound of his breathing changed, and she knew immediately. She reached him in 6 seconds. A tension pneumo, developing for hours, worsened by the medevac and the battle's stress. Tracheal deviation, no left side breath sounds. A catastrophic breathing failure. Kowalski! Eyes on me. He was unresponsive. His skin turned that pale shade of severe hypoxia. She grabbed a 14-gauge needle, located the insertion site by touch second intercostal, mid-clavicular, and plunged it in decisively. Hesitation is fatal with a needle D. Air hissed out instantly. Relief crossed his face as his chest moved again. Hand on his sternum, she counted his breaths and saw color return to his face, speaking calmly. Catheters in. Lung is reinflating. Slow it down. Good. He complied. Her hand stayed on his chest, sensing his body recover as her mind processed the sounds of the battle. She was multitasking on 2 levels, something she'd accepted as her nature. Then the sound changed. The incoming fire from the west had a new rhythm. An enemy had shifted, finding a new firing lane. She looked up from Kowalski and saw Harwick 70 meters out, pinned and totally in the open by a container. Moving his team was the correct tactical choice, but it left him vulnerable. Leadership requires being seen, and being seen is a risk. His approach, clear seconds before, was now a kill zone. An enemy at 240 meters had a perfect shot. 3 seconds. She released Kowalski, telling the Marine beside him, "Hold him down." She didn't run to Harwick, but moved 8 meters to a crate. It offered the angle she needed. No time to lie down. She took a knee, weapon up, finding the target in the scope. No time to regulate her breathing or pulse. She centered the crosshairs and fired. 240 meters away, the threat disappeared. Harwick looked from the enemy's spot back to her. She was already returning to Kowalski. Her hand went back to his chest, confirming the seal and lung function. She remembered her father saying something once. A November range day when she was 20. She'd asked how he reconciled his job with his life. He paused for a long time. "You don't. There's no wall between them. It's just your hands. They have their tasks. What they perform defines you. The talent isn't in one hand or the other. It's in knowing which to use and when. It's both." She took Kowalski's pulse while watching the perimeter. She realized then, deeply, that she wasn't what he was, but what he'd wanted her to be. He'd always said to chase the ideal, not the person. Owen Graff called a retreat at 11:14 p.m. Beyond the perimeter, the true cause remained unknown. The AAR would cite tactical errors, the loss of high ground, failed charges, and the defenders' controlled fire. The official reports cited those reasons, sure, but the grunts on the line had a different take. They said the assault crumbled when the enemy's nerve broke, a ripple of doubt against something they couldn't name. They didn't find a position on the verge of collapse. Every push was met by a calculated counter, not a scramble. Breaches that should have been fatal were plugged before they could be widened. That defense had a brain graft never saw coming. The garrison had a trump card he never saw. They vanished into the mountains. Harwick had medevac choppers airborne in 4 minutes. The base was clear in 17. She was on the 3rd bird, hands on 2 casualties, her voice a steady anchor. Darkness swallowed the peaks below. She focused only on the vitals. That was the mission now. Graff was taken 3 days later. Harwick was present for the transfer, a courtesy immediately granted without a word. He appraised a 51-year-old man who moved with the brutal efficiency of 12 years in bad places. Graff's hands were cuffed, his face a stone mask. He met Harwick's eyes, unafraid and ready for the accounting. Harwick let the silence stretch. Syria, 2012. Graf's reply was a clipped, "Yes. Your team? You read the file. I want your version." Graf stared back, then spoke for 40 minutes in a flat, debrief tone. The room was tomb silent after. When Harwick rose, he gave no empty, official apology. "This should have hit the records 12 years ago," he stated before turning to leave. "I'm making sure it does now." Something behind Graf's eyes finally gave way. It wasn't forgiveness. It was the look of a man whose burden was finally seen by someone with the will to act. "That'll do," Graf said. Harwick's after-action report ran 47 pages. He mentioned it to her in passing. He had outlined her full capabilities. He documented 22 field saves and the tactical calls that made them possible. His analysis was blunt. He also noted her non-disclosure, adding that it produced a superior outcome. He briefed her on his recommendation 4 days later. "A rear admiral wants a word," Harwick began. "Thomas Caldwell. He's been running an integrated training billet at NavSpec Warcom for 4 years now. He greenlit a black box coaching trial 3 years back," Harwick continued, a hint of irony in his voice. No idea who was behind it. She showed no reaction. "He wants a talk, not an order." About the curriculum's potential, Harwick watched her. "Says now that he knows it's you, he'd have pushed it through faster." She weighed the scale of it, 4,000 operators, a secret method becoming institutional doctrine. She balanced the power of anonymity against the force of an institution. "I'll speak with him," she finally said. Harwick nodded. Before he left, he added, "My own son is 22. He's at BUD-S. I think about what they teach him, and I see the disconnect between medical and TAC ops training." He paused for a beat. "What you built. My kid is going to need that. They all will." He stood. "Glad you were here." It was Dunar who spread the word. On the 5th evening, the rec hall was packed with a few hundred Marines. The overflow jammed the passageway, waiting for the news to travel. Tessa was not there. She was in the BAS, closing out paperwork. Dunar stood and spoke about Frank Cole. Not the man's history, but his soul. What 30 years in the Corps had taught him about the work and about the legacy he was leaving behind for them all. He talked about a daughter who'd inherited something earned, not given, forged in early morning PT, and a man's pure dedication to his craft. He told them about a promise made in a dark valley. Then he told them about their mentor, using the same salt-of-the-earth language they all understood. The anonymous guide from their training protocol was the contractor who had just been on their FOB. That calm, clear voice on the net the second night, directing fire teams through the chaos from behind cover with a round in her shoulder that had been her. A profound silence hit the squad bay, the kind that settles deep before the brain catches up. Lance Corporal Reed Kowalski sat up straight. He'd heard that voice on the training simulators 42 times. He'd never seen her face. The protocol insisted the instructor's identity was a non-factor, and he trusted it because it kept him alive. Now, listening, he mentally replayed every single session. A memory surfaced, a valley. A TQ applied in 90 seconds. The sting of a needle in pitch black, a firm hand on his plate carrier. "Breathe, Marine." He got to his feet, one sharp move. The man next to him rose, then another. It wasn't a command. It was instinct, a current running through men who'd shared the same crucible. In the hall, others were standing. He found her in the battalion aid station, finishing her reports. He'd been walking on his own for 2 days, the pneumothorax healing. Slow, but steady. He took the seat across from her, their eyes locked. "I know that voice," he stated, his own raw from disuse. She did not confirm it immediately. Third session, he pressed on. 2 years ago, the Moscow Sim. You said, "Don't triage for speed, triage for outcome. Your worst off isn't always your priority one. Work for the best overall result, not the single biggest save." He let the words settle. "I've replayed that maybe 400 times. It changed how I see the entire battlefield." She put her pen down. "Yes." He nodded sharply. "So why the secrecy?" She considered it for a moment. "If I'd put a face to the lessons, the first fight would have been about my credentials. about some civilian contractor teaching seasoned operators how to think under extreme pressure. She met his gaze squarely. That argument is about me. The material is what saves lives. The instruction had to stand or fall on its own merit. He absorbed that. 314 total sessions. An average of 14 operators a class, he calculated, his voice low. That's over 4,000 Marines you've trained. He paused. Including us. Out there, she picked up her pen. You need to rest, Kowalski. I know. He stood. He held her gaze, his foundations clearly rocked. At the hatch, he said only, Doc. She glanced up from her work. He gave a single, definitive nod. She returned it. The shoulder surgery took 2 hours. It was a clean repair. She came out of the anesthesia with a system reboot alertness, instantly online as the drugs faded. Harwick was in the chair beside the bed. Surgery went well, he said, looking up from his datapad. Surgeon gave a clean bill. He set the device down. Caldwell called while you were out. He's the guy behind this integrated training initiative. He's the one who authorized the anonymous protocol. Harwick met her gaze, said if he'd known, he'd have approved it faster with a bigger budget. So what's the ask? She said, her voice raspy. To build out the curriculum, formalize it with real funding and scale. He's not asking you to join up. He's proposing something entirely new. Wants to talk it over. She stared at the ceiling tiles, her mind running the new calculus. What did 4,000 trained operators become when a protocol became doctrine? She remembered Kowalski's simple math and what it represented. Was the anonymous edge worth more than institutional reach? Was there even a right answer to that question? I'll take the meeting, she said. Harwick nodded. My report's in, he added. It's all there. The whole story. What you did out there is now part of the official record. It is permanent. She stared back at him, her jaw tight. Good. Briggs appeared the next morning, early, moving like he was on a mission with a short timeline. He sat by her bed. He studied his own hands for a long moment. When you hit the LZ, he began, I said something. Colt, you don't. No, let me finish. She waited. I made a snap judgment. I said it loud, and I was dead wrong on every single level. He finally met her eyes. You told me I was covering for my team, and I was. But I also let a first take on you become gospel. That isn't protection. It's a prejudice I should have kicked years ago. A beat. I'm sorry. She met his gaze. Apology accepted, she replied. He offered a quick, grateful nod. Right. Then I want a slot in the first class. She raised an eyebrow. Class? Yeah, whatever Caldwell's putting together. The official course. I want to be the first name on the roster. His stare was rock steady. I'm 41, with a dozen years on the teams, and I always saw tactics and medicine as separate worlds. For 12 years, I had it wrong. I need a seat in that class. She assessed him for a long, quiet second. I'll add you to the list, she confirmed. He got to his feet. Your old man, he began, his voice dropping. Whatever else he was, he forged something solid in you. Then he was gone. Half a year later, the shadows beneath her eyes had vanished. She'd put back the 9 pounds lost to the deployment, the OR, and the long haul of recovery. It wasn't forced. It was the quiet result of steady chow, real sleep, and a system no longer wired for combat. Her left shoulder still gave her grief when a cold front moved in. A dull, stubborn throb in the reconstructed joint the doc said might be a permanent parting gift. She categorized it as data, not damage, just an equipment report. She ran at 0530 each morning, a 6-mile stretch down the bay with the Pacific on her left. The salt air before dawn was a sharp, clean jolt to the system. Her father used to say, routine wasn't a prison, it was the framework. The framework was what held you up when the world wanted to put you down. After her run and some quick grub, she would head to the training building for the new integrated combat medicine course. The first class had finished. The second was 2 weeks deep. The initial class held 16 operators. The current one had 22. The waiting list for the third was already pushing 47 deep. She paused by the door, taking in the 22 faces inside. They spanned from 22 to 44 years old, with a couple centuries of hard-won field experience between them. They were in that room because the brass finally got it, and because word had spread. It moved through the grapevine from men who'd been in the shit to those who were on their way. The skinny was straightforward. There's a course. It'll teach you what you don't know you're missing until it's the only thing that matters. Get in. Reed Kowalski was in the back row, fully healed and back to active duty. He'd vied for a slot in the second group the moment it opened up. He earned it, no strings pulled. His eyes found hers when she walked in, and he gave a slight dip of his head. She returned it. Colt Briggs was in the third row. He was locked on, his focus forward, the bearing of a man there to absorb, not to assess. She carried herself like a person who had torn down a foundational belief and was now erecting something stronger from the ruins. At the front of the squad bay, 11 words she'd sharpied on the whiteboard the previous night hung in the quiet. A tribute to her father, that valley, and the hard question of what really lasts. She hadn't bothered with a printer. She had used permanent ink. They stayed up between training cycles, less a lesson plan and more a core doctrine, the steel skeleton for everything that followed. Heal when you can, fight when you must, know the difference. Her gaze moved across the room. 22 men from every corner of the service, each with his own story. The single thing they shared was this. They had all been downrange, where that line was life or death, and they came here to master it. She called her mom on a Tuesday evening in November. Her BOQ window open to the constant shove of the Pacific, a sound that had been her white noise for 6 months. Her mother, 63, was still in the house in Denton, Texas, where Tessa was raised, where her father, Frank, had tended a garden with his usual exactitude. Her mom had taken over that garden after he died, saying it was the oddest piece of her mourning. Working his soil was her way of keeping him present in the world. They talked for 40 minutes. When her mother asked about the shoulder, she said it was holding up, which was true. When asked about the operators, Tessa described the second class. Their varied time in the suck, their intense focus, the distinct pride in watching an idea grow in men who would take it to places she would never go. A short silence filled the line. Then her mother spoke. I was scared to death when I heard what went down over there. Scared, then mad, then right back to scared again. I know, and then I thought about what your dad would have said, which was, he would have said, you understood the objective. A pause. He would have said, you were exactly where you needed to be. He'd say, I taught her to see the line. He did tell me that, Tessa said softly. I know, sweetheart. He told me he did. Her mother's tone was like a heavy pack being eased to the ground, not dropped, just set down. He was always playing chess while everyone else played checkers. Yeah, are you at peace with it? Tessa stared through the open window, the ocean a dark, rhythmic pulse. I believe I am, she said. I think I have been, but just never put words to it. Good, her mother said. That's what counts. Later that night, she took the letter from her jacket's breast pocket, where it had lived for 5 years and 3 months. She sat at her desk, the sealed envelope in her hands. The words within were already etched into her, absorbed years ago, not so much an order from outside as a piece of her own load-bearing walls. She held it. She remembered his words about the oath versus the principle behind it, about the gut-check decisions a true operator faces, about trusting your instinct when it all goes to hell. She had trusted her instinct. It was the right call. She opened the drawer of her desk, placed the letter in the center, and slid it closed. Not trashed, not forgotten, just settled. She didn't need to carry it anymore. Its message was already smelted into the framework of her being. She'd been reading it for 5 years. Its job was done, the lesson internalized. She was the lesson now. Monday morning, 0800. She stood before them, Coronado's sun filling the room, 22 operators watching her. Behind her, the 11 words were a stark reminder. Words she had written, words she believed in to her core. An update from Caldwell's office the night before confirmed it. Applications for the third class were twice the expected numbers. 2 more commands wanted to replicate the course. The Senate's classified testimony on Syria was now on record. What went down in the shadows was now documented. She let that sink in for a second, then broke the thoughts down. She caught Kowalski's eye in the back row, his notebook open, pen ready, watching with the focus of a man who'd paid the price for these lessons. Her eyes shifted to Briggs in the third row, his spine like a steel rod, a man who had shown in 2 weeks that a real choice to learn can reshape a person fast. She thought of her father on his 6-mile run at 0530 in San Diego. She thought of a man who understood that the most important work leaves no citations, no ribbons, no official file. He knew that what endures is the capability you instill in others, the principle that carries on long after you are gone. Not the shots you take, but the understanding you leave behind. She remembered a blacked-out valley, a letter in her hand, and a call made in the 2 heartbeats before breaking a promise she had to break. She thought of 63 Kias and 477 men who got to see dawn because of the harsh arithmetic she'd been forced to do. She thought of her mother's voice, of the letter finally put away after 5 years. She thought about what it takes to endure the fire and remain. She looked at the 22 men who would face their own hard times again, who were here to learn to hump a different kind of weight on their return trip. She drew a steadying breath. "Okay," she said, "time to get started." And they began.